The gunshot echoed across the frozen canyon, just as Josephine Norwood lost her footing on the ice-slicked rocks and plunged into the churning rapids of the White River. The water hit her like 1,000 knives, so cold it stopped her breath mid-scream. December in South Dakota Territory had turned the world into a landscape of white and gray, where the river ran dark and angry between banks of snow and ice. Josephine had been crossing at what should have been a shallow ford, trying to reach the town of White River before nightfall, when the crack of a rifle startled her horse. The mare had reared, throwing her directly into the current, and now the icy water was dragging her downstream toward the falls she could hear roaring somewhere ahead. She tried to swim, tried to grab onto something, anything, but her heavy wool coat was soaked through and pulling her down. Her fingers were already numb, useless. The current spun her around, and she caught a glimpse of the sky, pale and endless, before another wave crashed over her head. Her lungs burned. This was how she would die, she realized with sudden clarity, drowned in a river hundreds of miles from the Philadelphia home she had left behind 6 months ago. Then something solid hit her, an arm wrapping around her chest, and she was being hauled upward. She broke the surface gasping, choking on water and air both, aware of someone swimming beside her with powerful strokes. The roar of the falls was getting louder. They were still moving downstream, but slower now, angling toward the bank. "Hold on to me," a man's voice shouted near her ear, rough and commanding. "Don't fight me, or we'll both go over." She managed to grip his arm with her frozen fingers, and he pulled her closer against him. She could feel the incredible strength in his body as he battled the current, could hear his labored breathing. The falls were so close now, she could see the white spray rising into the air. They were not going to make it. They were going to die together, her and this stranger, who had jumped into freezing water to try to save her. His boot must have found purchase on something, because their downstream motion suddenly stopped. He pushed her toward a rock that jutted up from the water, and she grabbed it with both hands, holding on with every bit of strength she had left. He was beside her, one arm around her waist, the other gripping the rock. Slowly, agonizingly, he worked them both along the rock toward the shore, fighting the current that wanted to tear them away and send them over the falls that were now less than 20 yards downstream. When they finally reached the bank, he practically threw her up onto the snowy ground, then hauled himself up after her. For a long moment, they both just lay there, gasping and shaking. Josephine's entire body was convulsing with cold. Her teeth chattered so hard she thought they might break. "Gotta get you warm," the man said, pushing himself up to his knees. "Gotta get both of us warm, or we will not make it through the next hour." She tried to respond, but could not make her mouth form words. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing and started running, carrying her away from the river. She caught fragmented impressions through her chattering and shaking. A strong jaw dark with stubble, eyes the color of whiskey, wet dark hair plastered to his head. He was as soaked as she was, and she could feel him shivering too. But he ran steadily through the snow toward a stand of pine trees. There was a horse there, a big bay gelding, and tied to it was what looked like a pack mule. The man set her down for a moment, keeping one arm around her to hold her upright, while he tore into the packs with his free hand. He pulled out a thick canvas tarp and several wool blankets and a small axe. "Listen to me," he said, his face close to hers, his hands on her shoulders. "I need to get a fire going. You need to get out of those wet clothes, all of them. You hear me?" She nodded, still unable to speak. "Wrap yourself in these blankets. I will not look, but if you do not get dry, you will die. You understand?" Another nod. He handed her the blankets and turned his back, moving a few feet away to where there was a small clearing protected by an overhanging rock. She watched him through blurred vision as he quickly gathered fallen branches and used the axe to split some dry wood from a dead log. Her fingers would not work properly, but she managed to peel off her soaked coat, then her dress, then the layers of undergarments beneath. Everything was dripping and frozen. She wrapped herself in the first blanket, then the second, then sank down onto the tarp he had spread on the ground, still shaking violently. The man had a fire started somehow, though she had not seen how he managed it with wet hands and in this cold. The flames were small but growing. He fed them carefully, building them up, and then he stood and began stripping off his own clothes without ceremony or embarrassment. His shirt, his undershirt, his boots and socks, his pants. He wrapped a blanket around his waist and spread his wet clothes on rocks near the fire. then came and took her wet things and did the same. "Gotta get your core temperature up," he said, crouching beside her. "You mind if I sit close? Our body heat together will help." "Please," she managed to whisper. He sat down beside her and wrapped his blanket around both of them, pulling her against his side. Even through the layers of wool, she could feel that his skin was ice cold, but where their bodies touched, warmth began to slowly return. They sat huddled together, feeding the fire, as the winter afternoon faded toward evening. It was perhaps half an hour before Josephine could speak properly again. By then the fire was blazing, and some feeling had returned to her extremities, though she was still shivering. The man had not said anything more, just held her steady and kept the fire going. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life." "Lucky I was nearby," he said. His voice was deep, with the hint of a drawl. "What were you doing trying to cross the river alone?" "I was trying to reach White River before dark. My horse threw me when someone fired a gun." He tensed. "You see who fired?" "No, it came from up on the ridge. It might not have even been aimed at me, but it spooked my mare." "Could have been hunters," he said, but he sounded doubtful. "Could have been someone who did not care what they were shooting at. Either way, your horse is probably halfway back to wherever you came from by now." "I came from Fort Robinson," Josephine said. "I had been visiting a friend there. I should have stayed the night, but I wanted to get home." "You live in White River?" "For the past 3 months. I am a teacher. The town hired me to teach the children." He was quiet for a moment. "Long way from home for a school teacher." "This is my home now," she said, then added, "Or it is trying to be." He nodded as if he understood something in those words. "Name is Matthew Walker," he said. "I work cattle when I can find the work. Just finished a drive up from the Badlands and was heading into White River myself when I heard you hit the water." "Josephine Norwood," she said, "and I am forever in your debt, Mr. Walker." "Matthew," he corrected, "and you do not owe me anything. Could not very well let you drown." "Most people would not have jumped in," Josephine said quietly. "That water could have killed us both." "Well," Matthew said, and she heard something like a smile in his voice. "It did not." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the fire. The sun was setting now, turning the sky above the canyon-rimmed shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, beauty in a place that had nearly killed her. "We should stay here tonight," Matthew said. "Let our clothes dry properly and start fresh in the morning. White River is only about 5 miles from here. We can walk it easy enough, and my horse and mule can carry the gear." "What about my reputation?" Josephine asked, then almost laughed at herself. Here she was, alive by the grace of this stranger's courage, and she was worried about propriety. But Matthew took the question seriously. "I will make camp on the other side of the fire," he said, "and when we get to town tomorrow, we will tell them exactly what happened. Anyone who has a problem with you surviving can answer to me." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet certainty, that made Josephine believe him. She nodded. "All right, thank you." He stood up, keeping the blanket wrapped around himself, and checked their clothes. "These will need another hour at least," he said. "You hungry? I have some jerky and hardtack in my pack, and I can make some coffee if you want." "Coffee sounds like heaven," Josephine admitted. Matthew grinned, and it transformed his face completely. He was handsome, she realized with a small start, though in a rough-hewn way that was nothing like the refined men she had known back east. His face was weathered from sun and wind, his hands scarred and calloused, but there was kindness in his eyes and strength in every line of him. He made coffee in a battered tin pot, boiling water from his canteen, since neither of them was about to go back to the river any time soon. The coffee was strong and hot, and Josephine wrapped her hands around the tin cup he gave her, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. He gave her some of the jerky and hardtack, apologizing for the poor fare, but she ate gratefully. She had not realized how hungry she was. "So, what brings a teacher from back east all the way out to the Dakota Territory?" Matthew asked as they ate. Josephine considered how much to tell him, but there was something about almost dying together that seemed to strip away the need for pretense. "I needed a new start," she said. "My father died 2 years ago, and he left debts. Substantial debts. I sold everything to pay them, and when I saw the advertisement for a teacher in White River, it seemed like a sign, somewhere far away where I could begin again." "That took courage," Matthew said. "Or desperation," Josephine said with a slight smile. Some days, I am not sure which. Maybe both, Matthew said. Takes courage to act on desperation. Lots of people just sit with it and do nothing. What about you? Josephine asked. Where are you from? Texas originally, Matthew said, near San Antonio. My family had a small ranch, but we lost it after the war. I have been moving around ever since, working where I can. The war, Josephine said softly. It had been 13 years since the end of the Civil War, but its shadows still touched everything. Did you fight? I did, Confederate side, since that was where I was. But I was young and stupid and did not really understand what I was fighting for until it was too late. He stared into the fire. Lost my brother at Shiloh. Lost my father at Gettysburg. When I came home, my mother had already passed from fever, and the ranch was gone. Taxes we could not pay. I am sorry, Josephine said. He shrugged. It was a long time ago. I have made my peace with it, mostly. The wandering life suits me well enough. But Josephine heard something in his voice that suggested otherwise, a loneliness that matched her own. They were both drifters in their own ways, both looking for something they could not quite name. As the stars came out above them, bright and cold in the winter sky, Matthew banked the fire and set up their sleeping arrangements. True to his word, he made his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire from where he had laid out a bed for her, using the tarp and extra blankets from his packs. Their clothes were mostly dry now, though still damp in places, and they each took turns stepping away from the fire to dress in privacy. Josephine's dress was wrinkled and stiff from freezing and thawing, but it was better than nothing. She kept 2 of the blankets wrapped around herself as she settled down to sleep, aware of Matthew doing the same across the fire. The flames crackled between them, and she could hear the wind moving through the pines above. Matthew, she said into the darkness. Yes, thank you. For everything. Not just for saving me, but for being a gentleman about it. There was a pause, then his voice came back, warm and sincere. You are welcome, Josephine. Now get some sleep. We have a walk ahead of us tomorrow. She closed her eyes, exhausted and sore, and still a bit cold, but alive. So wonderfully, impossibly alive. Josephine woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment she was disoriented, wondering why she was sleeping outside, why everything hurt, and then memory crashed back. The river, the falls, Matthew Walker pulling her from the water. She sat up, still wrapped in her blankets, and saw him crouch by the fire, cooking bacon in a small pan. He looked up and nodded to her. Morning, how do you feel? Like I was thrown in a freezing river and dragged downstream, Josephine said, but she smiled to take any sting from the words. Everything hurts. That will pass in a day or two, Matthew said. You were lucky, no frostbite that I can see, and you did not get water in your lungs. He handed her a tin plate with bacon and some kind of fried bread and another cup of coffee. They ate in companionable silence, watching the morning light spread across the canyon. The river below still roared with the same deadly power, and Josephine shivered looking at it, remembering those moments of being dragged under, of not being able to breathe. Try not to think about it, Matthew said, seeing her expression. You survived. That is what matters. They broke camp efficiently, Matthew doing most of the work while Josephine helped where she could. Her muscles protested every movement, stiff and sore from the cold and the struggle. By the time they were ready to leave, the sun was fully up, though it provided little warmth in the December air. The walk to White River took them 3 hours. Matthew led his horse and mule, and he offered to let Josephine ride, but she refused. She needed to walk, needed to feel her legs working and her lungs breathing, needed to remind herself that she was alive. They talked as they walked, conversation coming easier now. Matthew told her about the cattle drive he had just finished, about the ornery-led steer who kept trying to break away, and the thunderstorm that had stampeded the herd. She told him about her students, about how surprising it was to teach children of so many different backgrounds all in one room, from the children of ranchers to the children of the Lakota, who sometimes came into town. Do you like teaching? Matthew asked. I love it, Josephine said, and realized as she said it how true it was. I love seeing them learn, seeing their faces light up when they understand something new. Some of them will probably never leave this area, but I hope I can give them tools to build better lives. Knowledge is a kind of freedom. My mother used to say something similar, Matthew said. She taught me to read when I was small. My father thought it was a waste of time for a ranch hand, but she insisted. I think she had dreams of me being something more than a cowboy. "And what do you dream of being?" Josephine asked. Matthew was quiet for a moment. "I used to dream of having land again, a place of my own. But that takes money I do not have, so mostly I just dream of steady work and a warm bed, and maybe someday finding a reason to stop wandering." There was something wistful in his voice that tugged at Josephine's heart. Before she could respond, though, they crested a rise and saw White River spread out below them. The town was small, just a collection of buildings clustered around the main street, with scattered homesteads spreading out into the surrounding prairie. But to Josephine it looked like home, the first place since leaving Philadelphia that had felt like it might be somewhere she could belong. As they walked down the main street, people stopped and stared. Josephine could see the questions in their eyes, see them taking in her disheveled appearance and the strange man walking beside her. She lifted her chin and met their gazes steadily. Sarah Mitchell, the baker's wife, and the closest thing Josephine had to a friend in town, came hurrying out of her shop. "Josie! We were so worried. When your horse came back without you yesterday, we thought something terrible had happened." "Something nearly did," Josephine said. She quickly explained about the river, about Matthew saving her, about spending the night in the canyon with a fire and proper distance between them. Sarah listened with wide eyes, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Oh, my Lord," she breathed. "Josie, you could have died." "I would have if not for Mr. Walker," Josephine said. She looked at Matthew, who stood quietly beside her, holding his horse's reins. "He risked his own life to save mine." By now, a crowd had gathered, and Josephine had to tell the story twice more. She made sure to emphasize Matthew's heroism and his propriety, aware that her reputation hung in the balance. But most people seemed more concerned with the fact that she was alive than with any impropriety. The frontier had a way of cutting through social niceties when survival was at stake. Thomas Whitaker, who owned the general store and served as the unofficial mayor of White River, shook Matthew's hand vigorously. "Son, this town owes you a debt. Miss Norwood here is the best teacher we have ever had. If there is anything you need, anything at all, you just let us know." "I appreciate that, sir," Matthew said, "but I just did what anyone would do." "Anyone would not have jumped into the White River in December," Whitaker said firmly. "That took more courage than most men have. You looking for work? We could always use good men around here." Matthew hesitated, glancing at Josephine, and she found herself holding her breath, hoping he would say yes. The thought of him leaving, of never seeing him again, was suddenly unbearable. "I might be," Matthew said slowly. "What kind of work?" "We have got ranches all around here that need hands," Whitaker said. "The Peterson place is the biggest, and I know Jack Peterson was saying just last week he needed more men for the winter. Pay is fair, and there is a bunkhouse. Or if you would rather work in town, I could use someone at the store, help with deliveries and heavy lifting." "I will talk to Peterson," Matthew said. "I am better with cattle than I am with shopkeeping, no offense meant." "None taken," Whitaker said with a laugh. "Come on, I'll take you out there myself. Peterson owes me a favor. But first, let us get you both someplace warm. Sarah, can you take Miss Norwood home and make sure she's all right?" "Of course," Sarah said, putting her arm around Josephine. "Come on, Josie. You look exhausted." Josephine let herself be led away, but she looked back over her shoulder at Matthew. He met her eyes and nodded, a small smile on his face. It felt like a promise, though of what, she could not say. The next few days passed in a strange blur. Josephine went back to teaching, though her students were full of questions about her adventure and kept interrupting lessons to ask her to tell the story again. She was sore and tired, and sometimes when she closed her eyes, she felt the river pulling her under again. Felt that terrible cold. But she was alive, and she did not take that for granted. Matthew took the job at the Peterson Ranch and moved into the bunkhouse there. Josephine did not see him for 3 days, and she found herself thinking about him constantly, about his strong arms pulling her from the water, about the way he had cared for her with such gentle respect, about his smile and his kind eyes, and the loneliness she had heard in his voice when he talked about wandering. On the 4th day, he came into town. She was in the schoolhouse, cleaning up after the children had left for the day, when she heard a knock on the door. Her heart jumped when she opened it and saw him standing there, hat in hand. "Matthew," she said, and was embarrassed by how breathless she sounded. "Josephine," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to see how you were doing." "I am well," she said, Please, come in." He stepped into the schoolhouse, looking around at the slates and primers, the wood stove in the corner, the map of the United States on the wall. "Nice place," he said. "You can tell someone cares about it." "I try," Josephine said. "Teaching is important work, even if it does not always feel that way." "It is," Matthew agreed. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "I have been thinking about you, about that day. I wanted to make sure you were all right, that you were not having nightmares or anything like that." "I have had a few," Josephine admitted, "but they are getting better, and I have you to thank for having any dreams at all." Matthew shook his head. "You do not have to keep thanking me." "I think I do," Josephine said softly. "You gave me my life back, Matthew. That is not a small thing." They stood looking at each other, and the air between them seemed to thicken with something unspoken. Josephine was suddenly very aware of how alone they were, how close he was standing. "I was wondering," Matthew said, and she had never heard him sound uncertain before, "if you might like to have dinner sometime, with me. There is a restaurant at the hotel, nothing fancy, but the food is good." "Are you asking to court me, Matthew Walker?" Josephine asked, trying to keep her voice light, though her heart was pounding. "I suppose I am," Matthew said. "If you would be willing. I know I'm just a cowboy, and you are an educated woman, but I would like to get to know you better, if you are interested." "I am very interested," Josephine said, and watched his face light up with a grin that made him look years younger. "Tomorrow evening, then?" Matthew asked. "I can come fetch you at 6. "Tomorrow at 6, Josephine agreed. He left shortly after, and Josephine sat down at her desk, her hands pressed to her cheeks, feeling like a girl again, instead of a woman of 24 who had crossed half a continent alone. Matthew Walker had saved her life, and now it seemed he might be offering her something more. The possibility of it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Their first dinner together was slightly awkward, both of them overly polite, carefully navigating the social dance of courtship. But as the evening went on, they relaxed into the easier conversation they had found by the fire that first night. They talked about everything and nothing, about childhoods and dreams and the strange paths that had led them both to this small town in the Dakota Territory. "I never expected to like it here," Josephine confessed over apple pie. "When I first arrived, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. Everything was so different from Philadelphia, so raw and rough. But there is something about this place, about the people. They are genuine in a way I never experienced back east. Frontier has a way of stripping away pretense," Matthew said. "Out here, what you are matters more than who you were. I like that about it." "Is that why you have stayed in the West?" Josephine asked. "Even after the war, even after losing your home, you could have gone back east." "And done what?" Matthew asked. "I have no education, no trade beyond working with cattle and horses. At least out here, those skills have value, and there is space to breathe. After the war, after all that death and destruction, I needed space." Josephine reached across the table and touched his hand. "I understand," she said. "That is what I needed too. Space to grieve my father and figure out who I was without him." Matthew turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I am glad you came here," he said quietly. "Glad our paths crossed." "So am I," Josephine whispered. They began seeing each other regularly after that. Matthew would ride into town whenever he could get away from the ranch, which was usually twice a week. Sometimes they had dinner together. Sometimes they just walked through the town or out onto the prairie, talking about their days. Josephine found herself looking forward to his visits more than she wanted to admit, found herself watching the road from her little house, hoping to see him riding up. The town noticed, of course. Small towns always noticed. But the gossip was mostly benign, people speculating about when Matthew would propose, about whether Josephine would give up teaching to be a rancher's wife. Sarah Mitchell teased her mercilessly and demanded details after every encounter. "He is a good man, Josie," Sarah said one afternoon as they shared tea. "And it is clear he is head over heels for you, the way he looks at you when you are not watching, like you are the most precious thing in the world." "We have only been courting for 3 weeks," Josephine protested, but she could feel herself blushing. "It is too soon to be talking about marriage." "Is it?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. "Out here, people do not have the luxury of long courtships. Life is too short and too hard. If you have found someone who makes you happy, someone you can trust, you do not let that go. Josephine thought about that conversation often in the days that followed. She and Matthew had indeed found something special, something that had started with him risking his life for hers, and had grown into genuine affection, and, she was increasingly certain, love. When she was with him, she felt safe and seen in a way she never had before. He listened to her opinions as if they mattered, asked her about her work, her dreams. And when he kissed her for the first time, standing under the stars on a cold January night, it felt like coming home. But winter in the Dakota Territory was harsh, and as January turned to February, the weather grew worse. Blizzards swept through regularly, dumping feet of snow and making travel dangerous. There were days when Josephine could not hold school because the children could not get there, days when she stayed huddled by her stove, reading and trying not to worry about Matthew out at the Peterson Ranch. He came to see her when he could, but the visits grew less frequent as the storms intensified. She missed him with an ache that surprised her, missed his steady presence and his quiet humor. She had not realized how much space he had come to occupy in her life until he was not there to fill it. In late February, one of the worst blizzards yet hit White River. It started in the afternoon, the sky turning an ominous gray-white, and by evening, the wind was howling and snow was falling so thick you could not see more than a few feet. Josephine made sure her wood supply was stacked inside and settled in for what she knew would be a long night. She woke in the middle of the night to knocking on her door. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, loud and insistent. Heart pounding, she grabbed her shawl and went to the door. "Who is it?" she called. "Josephine, it is Matthew. Please, let me in." She fumbled with the latch and pulled the door open. Matthew stumbled inside, covered in snow, his face red from the cold and wind. She slammed the door behind him and turned to find him swaying on his feet. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, fear making her voice sharp. "You could have frozen to death out there." "I know," Matthew said. His teeth were chattering. "But I had to make sure you were all right. The storm came up so fast, and I thought about you here alone, and I just had to see." "You rode all the way from the Peterson Ranch in this?" Josephine said, horrified. The ranch was 6 miles away. "Matthew, that was insane." "Probably," he agreed. He was shivering violently now. "But here I am." Josephine pushed down her fear and anger and focused on what needed to be done. "Get out of those wet clothes. All of them. I will get blankets." It was a strange echo of that first night, and Matthew seemed to realize it too because he let out a shaky laugh. "Seems like I'm always getting soaked around you." "This time it is your own fault," Josephine said, but there was no heat in it. She was too relieved that he was here, that he was safe. She turned her back while he stripped down, then helped him wrap himself in every blanket she owned. She built up the fire until it was roaring and made hot tea with whiskey in it, which he drank gratefully. Slowly the shivering subsided and color returned to his face. "You are a fool," Josephine said softly, sitting beside him. "A brave, wonderful fool." "I could not stand not knowing if you were safe," Matthew said. He took her hand. "Josephine, I know we have not known each other long, less than 3 months, but I think I am falling in love with you. No, I know I am. And when that storm hit, all I could think about was getting to you." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to, trying to be sensible and practical, but I cannot help it. I love you, Matthew Walker." He kissed her then, his lips cold at first but warming quickly, and Josephine kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard, both a little stunned by the intensity of it. "Marry me," Matthew said. "I know I do not have much to offer. I am just a ranch hand with no land and not much money. But I will work hard for you. I will do everything I can to make you happy. Just say yes." Josephine looked at this man who had twice risked his life for her, who made her laugh and made her feel cherished, who saw her not as a proper lady from back east, but as herself, wholly and completely. The answer was easy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They sat together through the rest of the storm, wrapped in blankets, making plans. They would have a simple wedding, they decided, just a ceremony at the church with their friends as witnesses. Josephine would keep teaching for a while, if the town did not mind a married teacher. Matthew would keep working at the Peterson Ranch and saving money. Maybe in a few years they could afford a small piece of land of their own. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried in snow. Matthew's horse had found shelter in Josephine's small barn, and Matthew dug them both out while Josephine made breakfast. It felt domestic and right, the two of them working together in companionable silence. When Matthew finally left to return to the ranch, Josephine stood in her doorway and watched him ride away, her heart full to bursting. She had come to the Dakota Territory looking for a new start, and she had found something better. She had found home. She had found love. They were married in March, on the first day warm enough to call it spring. The whole town turned out for the wedding, cramming into the small church to watch Thomas Whitaker, who doubled as a justice of the peace, join them in matrimony. Josephine wore a simple dress of pale blue that Sarah had helped her sew, and Matthew wore his best shirt and a string tie that looked charmingly awkward on him. When Whitaker pronounced them man and wife, Matthew kissed her with such joy and tenderness that Josephine heard several of the women in the audience sigh. They walked out of the church hand in hand, pelted with rice, laughing and happier than either of them had been in years. Jack Peterson had given them 3 days off, and the use of a line shack on the far edge of his property for a honeymoon. It was not fancy, just a small cabin with a bed and a stove, but it was private and it was theirs. They spent those 3 days learning each other, talking and laughing and making love with the awkward sweetness of two people new to each other's bodies, but deeply in love. On the second night, lying in Matthew's arms with her head on his chest, Josephine said, "Do you ever think about how different things would be if I had not fallen in that river?" "All the time," Matthew admitted. "If that shot had not spooked your horse, if you had crossed 5 minutes earlier or later, if I had not been nearby. There were so many ways we could have missed each other completely." "Fate," Josephine said, "or providence, or pure blind luck. Whatever it was, I am grateful for it." "So am I," Matthew said, kissing the top of her head. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Josephine Walker." She smiled against his chest, loving the sound of her new name. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, too." When they returned to White River, they moved into Josephine's house, which was small but adequate for the two of them. Matthew continued working at the Peterson Ranch, leaving before dawn and returning at dusk. But now he came home to a warm house and a wife who loved him. Josephine continued teaching, and the town raised no objections to her keeping her position now that she was married. They needed her too much to care about propriety. Life settled into a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary. They were happy in the small, daily ways that build a life together. Matthew teaching Josephine to ride properly so she would never be thrown again. Josephine reading aloud to Matthew in the evenings, everything from newspapers to novels. The two of them working in the small garden behind the house, planning what they would plant come summer. But they both still dreamed of having land of their own, a real home that belonged to them. Matthew squirreled away every spare cent from his wages, and Josephine did the same from her teaching salary. It was slow going, but they were patient. They had time. That summer, Jack Peterson made them an offer that changed everything. He was getting old, he told them, and his children had all moved away east and had no interest in ranching. He wanted to sell off portions of his land to good people who would care for it properly. He offered Matthew and Josephine 160 acres on the eastern edge of his property, with a creek running through it and good grazing land, for a price so reasonable it was almost a gift. "I know you do not have all the money now," Peterson said, "but you can pay me over time. Consider it an investment in White River's future. We need young families like yours putting down roots." Matthew and Josephine talked about it long into the night. It was a risk, taking on debt, but it was also the opportunity they had been hoping for. In the end, they agreed, shaking Peterson's hand and signing papers that made them landowners for the first time in their lives. They spent the rest of that summer and fall building their house, a simple structure of logs and sod, but solid and weatherproof. Friends from town helped with the raising, and there was a barn dance the night they moved in, everyone celebrating with music and food and dancing under the stars. Josephine danced with Matthew until her feet hurt, laughing and dizzy with happiness. Their first winter in the new house was hard, as all winters were in that territory, but they were snug and warm with each other. Josephine continued teaching, riding into town 3 days a week, while Matthew worked their land and hired himself out to other ranchers when he could for extra money. They bought a few head of cattle with their savings, the start of what they hoped would eventually be a real herd. In the spring, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when the doctor in town confirmed it, she rode home with her heart in her throat, unsure how Matthew would react. They had not specifically talked about children, had been so focused on establishing themselves. But when she told him, Matthew whooped with joy and picked her up and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing and telling him to put her down before he made her sick. He set her down gently and knelt in front of her, his hands on her still flat belly. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Josephine asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Matthew said. He looked up at her, and there were tears in his eyes. "I lost my family in the war, thought I would never have one again, and now I have you, and we are bringing a new life into the world. I do not have words for what that means to me." Josephine ran her fingers through his hair, her own eyes wet. "We are going to be a family," she said. "A real family." She kept teaching through the summer, though some of the town matrons clucked their tongues at a woman in her condition, working so late into her pregnancy. But Josephine loved her students and did not want to leave them until she absolutely had to. Finally, in August, with the baby due in just a few weeks, she reluctantly turned the schoolhouse over to a temporary replacement. Their son was born on a hot night in early September, with Sarah Mitchell serving as midwife and Matthew pacing outside until Sarah finally told him to come in and meet his child. He held the baby with shaking hands, this tiny red-faced creature, and Josephine watched him fall in love all over again. They named him Daniel, after Matthew's brother who had died at Shiloh. Daniel Matthew Walker, born in the Dakota Territory to parents who loved him more than anything in the world. The first years of Daniel's life were full and busy. Matthew worked constantly, building up their herd, improving their land. Josephine stayed home with the baby, though she missed teaching more than she had expected. But there was joy in watching Daniel grow, in seeing him take his first steps and speak his first words. And in the evenings, when the work was done, she and Matthew would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the prairie, Daniel sleeping between them, and feel blessed beyond measure. When Daniel was 2, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, it was twins, a boy and a girl, born in the spring of 1881. They named them Samuel and Grace, and suddenly their little house felt very full indeed. Matthew added on a room, working by lamplight after long days in the fields, determined to give his family the space they needed. As the children grew, the ranch prospered. Matthew had a good eye for cattle and a reputation for honesty, and people came to him when they needed stock. They were not rich, probably never would be, but they were comfortable, and the debts to Peterson were being paid steadily. They had built something real together, something that would last. Josephine sometimes thought back to that day in the river, to the cold and the fear and the certainty that she was going to die. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to someone else. But then she would look at Matthew, would see the scar on his shoulder from where he had cut it on a rock pulling her from the water, and she would remember. She would remember how close she had come to losing everything she now had. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Matthew gave her a gift. It was a small wooden box, handmade and polished smooth. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and when Josephine opened it, she saw it was the deed to their land, fully paid off. "It is ours," Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. "Free and clear. We own this place, Josephine. We built this together." Josephine threw her arms around him, crying and laughing at the same time. They had come so far from that frozen riverbank, from 2 lost souls looking for somewhere to belong. They had found it in each other, and in this land, and in the family they had created. The children grew into young people who were smart and strong and kind. Daniel had his father's steady nature and worked the ranch alongside Matthew, learning everything there was to know about cattle and horses and land management. Samuel was quieter, bookish like his mother, and Josephine taught him herself when he was young, before sending him to a proper school in town when he was older. Grace was fierce and independent, equally comfortable on a horse or with a book, and Josephine saw so much of her own younger self in her daughter. As the years passed, White River grew and changed. More families moved in, drawn by the railroad that finally came through in 1884. There was talk of the territory becoming a state, of progress and prosperity. Matthew and Josephine watched it all from their ranch, content with what they had built, with the life they had made. They added more children to their family over the years, until there were 6 in total, each one loved and cherished. The house had to be expanded again and again until it bore little resemblance to the small cabin they had started with. But it was full of life and laughter, full of the sounds of a family that was happy and secure. Josephine eventually went back to teaching when the younger children were old enough, taking a position at the expanded school in White River. She loved being back in the classroom, loved shaping young minds and giving children the tools they would need to build their own futures. And she never forgot where she had come from, the desperation that had driven her west, the second chance she had been given. Matthew built their ranch into one of the most successful in the region, known for quality cattle and fair dealing. But he never lost the gentleness that had drawn Josephine to him, the kindness that made him beloved by his children and respected by his peers. He was a good man, the best man she had ever known, and she fell more in love with him with each passing year. They grew old together on that land, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own. Grandchildren came to visit the ranch, running through the fields and climbing trees and learning to ride horses, just as their parents had. Matthew and Josephine would sit on their porch in the evenings, his hand in hers, and marvel at the life they had built. "Do you ever regret it?" Matthew asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, their hair gray and their faces lined, but their love as strong as ever. "Coming out here? Marrying a cowboy instead of some refined gentleman back east?" "Never," Josephine said firmly. "You gave me my life, Matthew. Not just the day in the river, but every day since. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You gave me love. How could I ever regret that?" "I am the one who should be grateful," Matthew said. "You took a chance on me, a drifter with nothing to offer but hard work and devotion. You made me believe I could be more than I was." "We made each other more than we were," Josephine corrected. "That is what love does. It lifts us up and makes us better." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the prairie they had made their own. In the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their laughter carried on the wind. It was a good life, Josephine thought. Not perfect, not without its hardships and sorrows, but good and full and real. Daniel had taken over most of the ranch operations now, working alongside his own sons to keep the family business thriving. Samuel had become a lawyer and moved to Rapid City, but he visited often with his wife and children. Grace had married a rancher from the next county over, and she and her husband were building their own legacy just as Matthew and Josephine had. The other children were scattered across the territory that was now the state of South Dakota, admitted to the Union in 1889. All of them were successful in their own ways. All of them carried the lessons their parents had taught them about hard work and integrity and the importance of family. As Matthew and Josephine entered their 70s, they began to slow down. The work that had once been easy became harder, their bodies no longer as strong or resilient. But they faced it together, as they had faced everything, supporting each other through the aches and pains of aging. One evening in early December, 50 years almost to the day since Josephine had fallen into the river, they sat together on their porch wrapped in blankets against the cold. The first snow of winter was falling gently, coating the world in white. 50 years, Josephine said softly. "Can you believe it has been 50 years since you pulled me out of that river?" "Best decision I ever made," Matthew said, squeezing her hand. "Jumping in after you." "It should have killed us both," Josephine said. "The cold, the current, the falls. We should have died that day." "But we did not," Matthew said. "We lived, and look at what we have done with that life. Look at our family, our legacy. That day was not an ending, it was a beginning." Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I love you, Matthew Walker. I have loved you for 50 years, and I will love you for however many more we have." "And I love you, Josephine Walker," Matthew said. "You are the greatest gift I have ever received." They sat together as the snow fell, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that mattered. The river had tried to take Josephine that day, but Matthew had fought it and won. He had saved her life, and in doing so, he had saved his own. They had saved each other, really. Two lost souls finding home in each other's arms. Inside the house, their family was gathering for dinner. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filling every room with noise and warmth. Soon someone would call them in, and they would join the celebration, surrounded by the people they loved most in the world. But for now, they sat together in the falling snow, hands clasped, hearts full, grateful for every moment they had been given. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and beautiful and home, and above them the sky was full of stars. It was a life well lived, a love well earned, and as they sat together in the gathering dusk, Matthew and Josephine Walker knew that they had found something precious and rare. They had found each other, and that had made all the difference. The years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of seasons changing and family growing. Matthew and Josephine watched from their porch as Daniel's eldest son began courting the blacksmith's daughter from town, as Samuel's practice expanded to serve clients across the state, as Grace's ranch flourished under her capable management. Each achievement filled them with quiet pride, knowing that they had raised children who were building good lives of their own. In their late 70s, they finally began to truly retire from active work. Daniel and his sons ran the ranch now, though Matthew still walked the property daily, checking on the cattle, inspecting fences, offering advice when asked. Josephine had given up teaching several years prior, but she tutored some of the grandchildren when they came to visit, unable to let go of her love for education entirely. Their days became quieter, more contemplative. They read together in the mornings, Matthew struggling through books that Josephine chose for him, still not as comfortable with reading as she was, but determined to share this pleasure with her. In the afternoons, they would walk slowly around their property, arm in arm, reminiscing about the early days when it had just been the two of them building something from nothing. "Remember that first winter?" Josephine said one afternoon, as they paused by the creek that ran through their land. "We were so poor we had to count every penny. I patched your pants so many times there was more patch than original fabric. And you made bread every day because we could not afford to buy it in town," Matthew added with a smile. "Your hands were always covered in flour." "I did not know how to make bread at first," Josephine admitted. "My first 5 loaves were completely inedible. You ate them anyway and told me they were delicious." "They were terrible," Matthew laughed, "like eating rocks. But I figured you would get better with practice, and you did." "We learned so much together," Josephine said softly. "How to build a life, how to raise children, how to make a home. None of it came easy." "The best things never do," Matthew said. He looked out across the land they had worked for so many decades, his eyes distant. "But we did it together. That is what made it possible." They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought family from across South Dakota and beyond. The house overflowed with people, 3 generations descended from Matthew and Josephine, all of them carrying pieces of the legacy their grandparents had built. There was food and music and dancing, and Josephine found herself crying happy tears as she watched her family celebrate. Matthew pulled her onto the makeshift dance floor, despite her protests that she was too old for such things, and they swayed together to a fiddle tune, surrounded by the people they loved most in the world. "Thank you," Josephine whispered in his ear as they danced, "for everything, for saving me that day, for building this life with me, for being the man you are." "Thank you for saying yes," Matthew whispered back, "for taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but dreams and determination. You made those dreams real, Josephine." As they entered their 80s, their health began to fail more noticeably. Matthew's joints ached constantly from decades of hard physical labor, and he walked with a cane now. Josephine's eyesight was failing, making reading difficult, which frustrated her to no end. But they adapted as they always had, finding new ways to enjoy their time together. They moved into town in the spring of 1903, into a small house near the school where Josephine had taught for so many years. The ranch was firmly in Daniel's capable hands now, and while they missed the land, they had to admit that town life was easier on their aging bodies. There was a doctor nearby, neighbors who checked on them, and the church was just across the street. But they still visited the ranch every week, Matthew insisting on making the trip even when it exhausted him. He needed to see the land, needed to know that the work they had started was continuing. Daniel indulged his father's need, always welcoming them with warm embraces and updates on how the cattle were doing, what improvements they were making. One cold December morning, nearly 55 years after the day Josephine had fallen into the river, Matthew woke up with pains in his chest. Josephine, sleeping beside him, as she had for more than half a century, felt him stir and woke instantly. "What is wrong?" she asked, hearing the labored sound of his breathing. "Just some pain," Matthew said, trying to smile, though she could see the fear in his eyes. "Probably nothing." But it was not nothing, and they both knew it. Josephine helped him sit up, propped against pillows, and sent for the doctor. He came quickly, examined Matthew, and confirmed what Josephine had already feared. Matthew's heart was failing. "How long?" Josephine asked, her voice steady, though inside she was breaking apart. "Could be days, could be weeks," the doctor said gently. "There is no way to know for certain. Make him comfortable, keep him calm, and make sure the family comes to say goodbye." The next few days were a blur of activity as word spread, and family members began arriving. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the small house, taking turns sitting with Matthew, holding his hand, telling him they loved him. He was lucid most of the time, smiling at his family, offering words of wisdom and love, though the effort clearly exhausted him. Josephine barely left his side, sleeping in a chair next to the bed, holding his hand through the long nights. 55 years they had been together, 55 years since he had pulled her from that river, and she could not imagine a world without him in it. On the third night, when most of the family had finally gone to bed and it was just the two of them in the quiet darkness, Matthew squeezed her hand. "Josephine," he whispered, his voice weak. "I am here," she said, leaning close. "I am right here. I need you to know," Matthew said, each word an effort, "that you have been the joy of my life. Every day with you has been a gift. I have no regrets." "Neither do I," Josephine said, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me everything, Matthew, everything that matters." "Promise me," Matthew said, "that you will keep living. Keep reading and teaching and loving our family. Do not let grief swallow you." "I promise," Josephine said, though she did not know how she would keep such a promise. "But you need to rest now. Save your strength." "Love you," Matthew breathed. "Always." "Always," Josephine echoed. He fell asleep shortly after, his breathing shallow but steady, and Josephine sat holding his hand, memorizing the feel of it, the way his fingers curled around hers even in sleep. This man who had been her partner, her lover, her best friend for more than half her life. This man who had seen her at her worst and her best and had loved her through all of it. Matthew Walker died just before dawn the next morning, with Josephine's hand in his and his family gathered around him. He went peacefully, slipping away so quietly that for a moment Josephine did not realize he was gone. Then she felt the stillness in him, the absence of the life force that had animated him for 82 years, and she knew. The funeral was held 3 days later, and it seemed like half of South Dakota attended. Matthew had been well known and well loved, a man who had built something lasting and treated everyone with fairness and respect. The church overflowed with people, and the hymns they sang were the same ones Josephine had sung at their wedding 55 years before. They buried him on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the land he had loved, with a simple headstone that read, "Matthew Walker, 1821-1903, beloved husband, father, grandfather, he lived with courage and love." In the weeks after Matthew's death, Josephine moved through her days in a fog of grief. She kept her promise to him, kept living, but everything felt hollow without him. She ate because her children insisted, slept because her body demanded it, but found no joy in anything. It was Grace who finally pulled her out of the worst of it, arriving one morning with a stack of books and a determined expression. "Mama," Grace said, sitting down across from her mother, "Papa would not want you to fade away like this. He made you promise to keep living, and you are not honoring that promise." "I do not know how to live without him," Josephine admitted. "He has been part of my life for so long. I do not remember who I was before him." "Then maybe you need to figure out who you are after him," Grace said gently. "Not instead of him, never instead of him. But in addition to all that you shared, you are still a mother and a grandmother and a teacher. You still have so much to give." Josephine looked at her daughter, this fierce, loving woman who carried so much of both her parents in her, and felt something shift inside her. Grace was right. Matthew would not want her to spend whatever time she had left mourning. He would want her to live fully, to embrace the family they had built, to find meaning and purpose. So she began, slowly, to reclaim her life. She started reading again, devouring books the way she had when she was young. She began tutoring again, working with children in town who needed extra help with their studies. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the early days of the ranch, about the Wild West that was rapidly becoming tamed and civilized. And she wrote. Josephine had never been much of a writer, but she found that putting words on paper helped process her grief, helped her remember the good times without being overwhelmed by loss. She wrote the story of their lives together, starting with that day in the river and continuing through 55 years of marriage. She wrote it for her descendants, so they would know where they came from, what kind of man Matthew had been, what they had built together. The years after Matthew's death were not easy, but they were not without meaning. Josephine lived for another 12 years, dying peacefully in her sleep, at the age of 94. In those 12 years, she saw great-great-grandchildren born, saw the ranch continue to prosper under Daniel's management, saw the old wild west of her youth transformed into a more settled, civilized place. When she died in 1915, the world was on the brink of a great war, but in her corner of South Dakota, there was peace. Her funeral was as well attended as Matthew's had been, testament to the impact she had made on her community as a teacher and a mother and a woman of courage and conviction. They buried her next to Matthew on the hill overlooking the ranch, her headstone simple like his. Josephine Norwood Walker, 1829-1915, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher. She lived with grace and wisdom. Their descendants continued to work the land they had claimed, generation after generation, carrying on the legacy Matthew and Josephine had established. The ranch prospered through the 20th century, adapting to new methods and technologies, but never losing sight of the values its founders had instilled. Hard work, integrity, respect for the land, and above all, family. The house Matthew had built was eventually replaced by a more modern structure, but the family kept the original cabin as a kind of museum, a reminder of where they had come from. Inside, they preserved Josephine's memoir, the story she had written of their lives together, and new generations would read it and marvel at the courage and love of their ancestors. The creek still ran through the property, and the hill where Matthew and Josephine were buried became a family gathering place, somewhere to come and remember, to feel connected to the past. On winter days, when snow fell soft and silent across the prairie, it was easy to imagine two young people standing on that hill, looking out at land they had just claimed, dreaming of the future they would build together. The story of Matthew pulling Josephine from the river became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. It was a story about courage and quick thinking and the randomness of fate, but mostly it was a story about love, about two people who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful and lasting. Their great-great-grandson, visiting the ranch for a family reunion in the early 21st century, stood on the hill where they were buried and tried to imagine what the world had been like when they were young. It was so different now, with cars and airplanes and computers, with cities stretching across what had been open prairie. But some things remained the same. The land itself, the big sky, the values of family and hard work and integrity that had been passed down through the generations. He placed flowers on both graves, touching the weathered headstones with reverence. These people he had never met had given him so much, a heritage to be proud of, a legacy of love and courage, a reminder that the choices we make ripple out across time, affecting people we will never know. As the sun set across the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, just as it had on that evening, so many years ago, when Matthew and Josephine had sat together and marveled at the life they had built, there was a sense of continuity, of connection across the years. They were gone, those two brave souls who had defied death and built a dynasty, but they were not forgotten. Their love story, which had started with a cowboy jumping into freezing rapids to save a drowning woman, had become the foundation for a family tree that spread across the country. Dozens of people could trace their lineage back to that moment, to that choice Matthew had made to risk everything for a stranger. And in that way, they lived on. Not just in memory or in stories, but in the blood and bone of their descendants, in the values they had passed down, in the land they had claimed and worked and loved. The river that had nearly taken Josephine's life had instead become the beginning of something remarkable, a love that transcended time and death, a legacy that would endure for generations yet to come. On winter evenings, when the wind howled across the Dakota prairie and snow drifted against the old headstones on the hill, locals sometimes said they could see two figures standing there, hand in hand, looking out across the land they loved. Just a trick of the light, the rational ones said. But those who believed in such things knew better. They knew that some loves are too strong to be contained by something as small as death. That Matthew and Josephine Walker still watched over the family they had started, the land they had claimed, the life they had built together. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when they leave this earth, Matthew and Josephine were together still, holding hands as they had for 55 years of marriage and 12 years apart that were nothing compared to eternity. They were together, as they always would be, two halves of one whole, bound by a love that had started in freezing rapids on a December day and would last forever. The end of their earthly story was just the beginning of their legacy, and that legacy lived on in every descendant who worked the land with integrity, who loved their family fiercely, who faced challenges with courage and grace. Matthew and Josephine Walker had built more than a ranch. They had built a family, a community, a legacy of love that would endure as long as there were people to remember and honor it. Their story was complete, their lives well lived, their love eternal. From the rapids that had nearly claimed Josephine to the peaceful hill where they rested together, from the struggles of those early years to the prosperity and peace they had eventually found, it was a life that mattered, a love that changed the world, one family at a time. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind.